Let's continue our exploration of Next.js and React with a Django-Ninja backend. In this video, we're going to take this user interface that we built previously, and we're going to allow the device to be assigned a new location when we click this button. What we're going to do is bring up a modal, and we're going to use DaisyUI in order to do that. So we're going to move some of the styling over to DaisyUI components. And we're also going to add a form that's going to allow us to add a new device to our backend and then allow us to view that in this user interface. So let's get started. If we go back to the list page, you can see the very simple application that we've built at the moment. We have a list of all devices, and each one of these is a Next.js link tag. And when we click that, we get taken on the client side to the device detail page that lists out the information about that device. Now, in the last video, we finished by adding this button here, and we also added some dummy code that fetched all of the locations from the backend. We're now going to use that in this video, so let's open up VS Code. Now we're on the device detail component here, and that exports a React component called device. And at the top here, we have fetched the locations from the backend, and we were doing that check to make sure that that had been successful. I'm going to remove that line of code, and what we're going to do is go back to the front end, and you can see that has disappeared from the top. Now let's start by adding DaisyUI to this project. Now if you're not familiar with DaisyUI, let's go to the documentation. And as it says, it's the most popular component library for Tailwind CSS. We're going to use that in this video, but we need to install it in this Next.js application. So let's expand the sidebar here, and we're going to go to the installation page. And what we're going to do is we're going to install it using npm. Now in order to do this with Node.js, we can copy the npm install command, and I'm going to go back to VS Code and stop the server here. And we're going to paste that command in, and that's going to install DaisyUI and add it to the node modules. And once that's completed, what we need to do is go to the tailwind.config.js file. And this is the configuration file that allows you to adjust the settings for Tailwind CSS. And among other things, it allows you to add plugins to Tailwind. And that's what we're going to do now. If we go back to the DaisyUI documentation, let's copy this require statement, and we're going to paste that in here. And we should now have access to DaisyUI in this project. So let's start the server again with npm run dev at the bottom. And we're going to go back to the component, and we're going to look for that assign location button. At the moment, we've given it some classes from Tailwind directly, but I'm going to remove these. So let's get rid of background green and also the padding. And what we're going to add here is a DaisyUI component class called button. And if we hover over that, you can see some of the styles that are applied to that button. And as well as just the button, we're also going to give it some color here with the button success class. And we're going to save that and go back to the page, and we're going to see how this looks now. So if we refresh this page, you can see that the styling for this button has now changed. We're using the component from DaisyUI, and it's given it that nicer look and feel, and the color is slightly changed as well. So when we click this button, again, nothing is happening, but what we're going to do now is add a modal to this page. Now in order to add a modal, we're going to reference this page in the DaisyUI documentation. And a modal is basically a pop-up, a dialog box that appears on the screen when you click a button or a link. So let's see if we have an example of that here. We have a button here that says open modal. When we click that, we get this kind of dialog appearing on the screen, and that's what we want to replicate when we click this assign location button. So let's start with that now. If we look at the JSX code here, we're going to copy this dialog here. So let's copy that, and we're going to go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do is actually create what's called a client component in Next.js. Now the reason for this is because what we're about to do depends on user interactivity. It's the user who clicks this button, so in order to respond to those actions, we need the code to be running on the client. And Next.js offers server components, as we saw in the last video, but it also offers these client components. And client components are similar to the old school way of doing React components, where everything runs in the client on the browser, and therefore you do have access to events that are occurring in the browser environment. And one of those is of course a click event on a button. We cannot listen for that on a server. We need to make a client component here to handle this. So what I'm going to do in VS Code is I'm going to create a folder called components. So let's do this in the source directory here. We're going to create a new folder called components, and we can place a new component file in this folder. So let's create a new file here, and I'm going to call this location modal.js. So this is the client component, and we're going to use this on the client side to handle this interactivity when the user clicks the button. So we need to declare that this is a client component, and in Next.js that's very simple to do. At the top of the file we just type use client, and this tells Next.js that the code we're about to write needs to be shipped to the client. And that allows us to use things like event listeners on the client and respond to these events. So let's get started writing this component. We're going to export a function called location modal here. And that's going to take some props, and we can create the component function here. And what we need to do here is return some JSX code. Now we're going to return two things. The first thing that we want to add here is the button itself. So if we go back here, this button needs to be part of the client component if we want to listen for the click event. So let's go back to that component, the detail component here, and we're going to cut this button out of this component, and we're going to paste it into the top here. And this is going into the location modal component. And I'm going to surround all of the JSX code that we're about to write in a div. And as well as the button, we need to paste in the styles from the DaisyUI modal. So I'm going to take this dialog here. I think we copied it earlier, but we're going to paste it in now, and we're going to do that underneath the button, and I'm going to fix the indentation. So we now have a button and we have a modal here. What we need to do when we click this button is show the modal that's displayed here. Now in order to do that, we're going to add an onClick listener here. So we can use onClick, and we're going to set that to a JavaScript function here where we call document.getElementById, and we're going to get this dialog's ID, which is myModal1, and we can change that if we want to, but we're going to paste that in there. And then in DaisyUI, the modal has a method called showModal. So we're going to call that showModal function, and that's all we need to do in this component here. Now what we are going to do now is import the location modal component. We need to import that into the device detail page and show it at the same location where the button previously was, and that was at this point in the JSX code. So I'm going to go to the top of this page.js file, and we're going to bring an import into this component. So what we're going to import is the location modal, and we're going to do that from the app directory, and it's the components directory within that, and it's the location modal file. So we're importing the location modal, and then we can go down here and we can actually render this component instead of the button itself. So we're going to render the location modal here, and we're just going to save this and go back to the page, and we're going to test this out. So if I click this button, you can see we now get the modal appearing on the page. Now this is not what we want to appear in the modal. What we want to show in this modal is a form that's going to contain all of the locations, and it's going to allow us to assign or reassign a location to the device that's in question. So what we need to do in this location modal is pass through to it the device itself and also the list of locations. Now we have these in the component. We have device and locations available, so we can pass them through as props here. So I'm going to do that now. So we're going to pass a prop called locations. We're going to set that equal to the locations that we fetched from Django-Ninja, and we're also going to pass the device. So let's pass that through as well, so that the child component or the client component knows which device it's working with. And once we pass these props through to the location modal, we can go back to that component and we can accept those props, and we can destructure the objects that we're passing through here. So I'm going to create a couple of variables here, one called device and the other is called location, and that is going to be created by destructuring the props. Now this syntax here is how to do that. We have an object, that's a JavaScript object called props, and that contains fields, for example props.device, and this syntax is going to allow us to get the device and store it in a variable by referencing this props.device, and it does it using this object-like notation. So now we should have access to the device and also to the list of locations, and that should be plural here, locations. Let me just make sure I've spelled that correctly. Yep, I have. So let's go back to the location modal, and we want to display in the dialog, which is the modal itself, the form containing the list of locations, and that's going to allow the user to submit a new location to the server. So I'm going to change a few things here. First of all, the header here, instead of saying hello, I'm going to replace that with the header change location. And then we're going to change this paragraph tag as well. So let me remove that, and I'm going to paste a new one in here, and it's going to say change the location of device, and then we're going to reference the device object's name property. Once we've done that, we can create a form element, And what we're going to put in the form is a select input. So let's go to the DaisyUI documentation and some of the classes that DaisyUI has for creating these select elements. We have a form control class that can be applied to the container element, and we also have classes such as select and select bordered and select ghost and so on. I'll leave a link to this page below the video. What I'm going to do is create a div with the class of form control and then create the select element that has these classes of select and select bordered. So let's go back to VS Code and I'm going to paste this in here. So we have this div here and it has the class of form control and also margin bottom 4, and then we have a select element. Now a select element needs options. So let's add some options now. We're going to start with an empty value. So this option is going to be disabled and it's going to have an empty value, and that's going to say select location. And underneath that, we're going to map over the locations that have been passed as props into this component. So let's go back down here and let's create a JavaScript expression here. We're going to take these locations and we're going to map over them. And for each location, we're going to return an option element. Now I'm going to do this on a new line so that it's easier to read. And we can split this up here. What we're going to pass here is a key, and we're going to set that to the location's ID, which is coming from our Django-Ninja backend. That's the primary key in the database for that location. And as well as the key, we're going to give the option a value, and that's going to be what's ultimately passed to the backend, and that's also going to be the location's ID. And within the actual option element, the text that's going to be rendered is going to be the location's name. Now if you're wondering where these field values come from, if you go to the Django-Ninja API, you can see this locations endpoint. It returns a list of all of the locations, and each one of them has an ID and a name. So we are just referencing these properties on the objects here. And for each location, we're creating an option within this select element. Now the final thing to do here is to move the modal actions into the form. Now I'm going to change the structure of this. So let's start by removing this form here. And I'm going to move this modal action up into the form element so that when we click one of the buttons, it's going to submit the form with the specified location. So let's add another button here, and it's going to be of type submit. And that's going to have a class name set to the button component from DaisyUI, and this time, as before, we're going to use button primary. This is the submit button, and we also want a button that's going to allow us to close the modal. So let's add a second button here, and that's going to again have the class name of button, and when we click that, it's going to call a function within this client component called closeModal. So the next step is to actually write this function. So let's copy the name of the function, and we're going to go back up to the top here and let's create the function. So it's going to be called closeModal, and it's going to take the event as a parameter, and this is a callback function that's going to be called when we close the modal, or rather when we click that button to close the modal. Now we want to start by calling 𝗵𝗵𝗽𝗍default. So that is the event when we, for example, submit the form. We don't want the default action of trying to send form data to the server, so we can call event.preventDefault. And what we're also going to do is we're going to target this modal here, and we're going to do that using document.getElementById, and the ID is my modal1, and then we can call another function that DaisyUI provides on the modal, and that is the close function. And the close function is going to make the modal invisible. It's going to hide it from the page when it's called. Now let's save this for now, and we're going to, as a sanity check, go to the web page and we're going to test this out and see what it looks like. So when we click assign location, this time our modal contains a simple form, and if we look at the select elements options, we can see we have one for each location in our backend. Now at the moment, if we submit this, it's not going to work. We have no submit handler function on the component that's going to handle sending that submitted data to the Django-Ninja API. So we're going to create that in a second. If we click the close button, you can see that that is actually working. It's going to close the modal. So the next step is to handle the submission of this form. So when we click submit with a new location, we need to send that data to our Django backend, and Django-Ninja, the endpoint that we created in the first video, is going to handle that and create that location for the device in the database. So we need to know the location that's been selected by the user in this client component, and for that we're going to use the useState hook in React. And useState, it's worth noting here, that can only be used now in these client components because this refers to client-side state. It doesn't make sense to have useState on the server, so you can only use that if you've declared that it's a client component. So now that we've imported useState, just underneath the props here, what we're going to do is we're going to call useState, and I'm going to create a variable called selectedLocation, and we're also going to create a setter here called setSelectedLocation. So the useState hook returns two values, so let's call the function, and what we're going to pass as a default here is just an empty string. Now the purpose of this useState hook is that when the user selects a location from this particular form that we see here, we want to store that selected location in this variable here. This is a piece of state on the client-side component. So we need to bind what's been selected to this value. So how do we do that? Let's go back down to the select element that we have, and that's here on line 27. Now, as well as the class name, I'm going to create a value here on the select, and the value is going to be set to whatever the selected location is at a given time. And what we need to do when the selection changes is we create an onChange event handler, and this is going to be some JavaScript. It's going to be a dynamic callback function, and it's going to take the event and it's going to call that setSelectedLocation, and it's going to pass e.target.value. So let's explain quickly what's going on here. We have the select element that contains all of these locations. When the selection changes, we're going to call the setter that we got back from the useState hook, and we're going to pass the value here into that setter, and that's going to set the variable selectedLocation to that value. Now if we look at the values on the options here, you can see the value is set to the location IDs. So the selected location is going to track the ID that has been selected at a given time. So whenever the user selects one of these locations, it's going to update that state, and it's going to store the value in this state called selectedLocation. Now the final thing to do here is to add a submit handler to our form. So at the moment the form is here. When we submit the form, we need to handle that and call the Django-Ninja API. So what I'm going to do on the form element is we're going to add another handler here, and that's the onSubmit handler. And again, this can only be done inside a client component. It cannot be done on a server component. That doesn't make sense. When you submit a form, that is done on the browser, so it's a client action. Now let's call the function that we're going to define handleSubmit, and we're going to copy the name of that, and we're going to scroll up here and define this function at the top. So let's create the function handleSubmit. Again, that's going to take the event as a parameter, and again we're going to call e.preventDefault to prevent that submission refreshing the page. Now what we want to do is we want to take the selected location, that's the one that's been selected in the modal, and we want to submit that to the server. But to begin with, we need to make sure that we have a selection. So we're going to create an if statement here, and if we don't have a selection, what we're going to do is just return from this function. So the handleSubmit function is not going to send any data to the Django backend if we haven't made a selection. Now if we have made a selection, we can progress to the next part of this function. I'm going to create an endpoint here, and we're hard coding this. Of course you'd want to move that out to some sort of configuration, but the endpoint here is /API/devices, and then we have the device slug, and then set location. Now where is this coming from? If we go back to our Django-Ninja API, we had this endpoint at the bottom here, and it's a post endpoint, so it takes a post request, and the idea is that this endpoint should allow the device to be assigned a new location. So this is the URL path for that endpoint, and that's what we're setting this to now. And what we can do is we can call the Next.js fetch function and pass that endpoint in. Now this needs to be a post request, so we're going to pass some configuration here to fetch, and we're going to specify that the method is post. And because we're sending the post request, we need to also send a body of data. Now for the body, I'm going to call the JSON.stringify function in JavaScript, and that's going to convert some sort of JavaScript value into some JSON data. Now what we need to convert here and what we need to send to the endpoint is the location ID for the new location that has been selected. So let's create a JavaScript object where we have a key called location ID, and the value we want to send is the selected location. So let's paste that in there. If we go back to our Django-Ninja endpoint, that is expecting a location ID. It uses this pydantic model called device location patch, and if we look at schemas.py, that is an object that expects an location ID. So we're sending that through in this body here to the fetch call. And when we get the response here, what we want to call is the .then function, and we're going to take that response and we're going to convert that from JSON to a JavaScript object using response.json. And again, that returns a promise, so we can use the .then function, and then we can finally get access to the data in the form of a JavaScript object. Now when we get that response, we have a device with a new location. We need to tell the client about that so that it can refetch that data from the back end. So at the moment we have a proximity sensor, and that has a location set to the garage. If we reassign the location, let's say to the greenhouse, and submit that, we need to somehow refresh the page and update the state. Now how do we do that with Next.js? Let's go to the documentation, and we're going to reference this useRouter. And this is a hook that will give you access to the router object. And that router object allows you to perform refreshing of pages, and it also allows you to perform client-side navigation. So for example, we have a router.push function that will perform a client-side navigation to the provided route. And as well as that, we have some other functions here. The one I want to look at is this one. It's called router.refresh. And this is going to refresh the current route. And what that means is it's going to make a new request to the server, and it's going to refetch the data request and re-render the server components. Now if we look at what we have in this application, we have a location modal. That is a client component, and all that's in this client component is our button and the modal. And that is called by the parent component, which is this one here. You can see it calling the location modal. And this is the component for the device detail page. Now that is not a client component. That is the default, which is a server component. So what we want to do when we update the location is we want to call the router.refresh function. That's going to make that new request to the server, and it's going to refetch the data and then re-render the server components. And as it says here, the client will merge the updated React server component payload without losing unaffected client-side state. So I hope that makes sense. Let's now see this in action just to demonstrate how it works. We're going to go back to the location modal. At the top of this component, I'm going to import the useRouter hook from next/navigation. And then if we go back to the handle submit function here, when we get the data from the response after the location has been updated, we're going to call router.refresh. So that is going to perform those requests to the endpoint, and it's going to update any affected state. And what we also want to do is take this line of code here where we close the modal, and we want to call that after we've refreshed the page. So let's add that in there, and we're going to save this file and go back to the page now. And what we can do is we can refresh this page, and we're going to try and assign a new location for this proximity sensor. So instead of the greenhouse, let's try and assign it to the office. We're going to submit that, and we can see we're getting an error. Now if we look at the console here, we can see the information about this. JSON.stringify.then is not a function. So I think I've messed up the brackets in this call. So let's go back to VS Code, and it's this body that we have here. After we call JSON.stringify, we pass the JavaScript object, and then we need to close those brackets there. And I think I need to move these calls to .then out of this part of the code. So let's close off the fetch request and add the .then here, and we can remove the brackets at the end. Sorry about that, that's a bit of a mouthful, but if we do this, what we're doing is we send the fetch request, and the promise is returned by .fetch, so we need to make sure the then is in the correct place. Let's now save this and go back to the page. If we refresh this page, this time we're going to try and move this from the greenhouse to the office. We submit that, and again we're getting an error. So let's go back to the console here, and this time it's that the router is not defined. Now that again is a mistake I've made, so apologies for that. We need to actually call the useRouter hook in order to get this router back. So we need to do that at the top of the component. So let's create a variable called router, and we're going to do that by calling useRouter. So let's save this again, and hopefully it's third time lucky here. I'm going to close the developer tools, and this time it seems to have updated the location to the office. Let's try and reassign that now to the garage. If we submit that, we get back the location being the garage now, and if we refresh this page, you can see that that is state that has persisted. And if we go to the actual API endpoint response for the proximity sensor, you can see the location here, and it is indeed now set to the garage. So we now have a Next.js application that allows us to take this device detail page, and it allows us to update the location of a given device and assign it to a new location. Let's now move on to the final part of this video. We're going to add a new page that's going to allow us to create a new device. So let's go back to VS Code and we're going to go to the app directory and we're going to create a new page for this form that's going to allow us to add a new device. So we have this devices directory and we want to create a new folder here because we're going to create a new route segment, and let's call this create, and then inside the create directory we can create our page.js file, and that's going to tell Next.js that this is going to represent a page in our application. Now just to speed things up here, I'm going to create a component called device create, and that's going to call a function that we're going to define in a second called getLocations. And that's because when we create a device, we need to give the user the ability to specify one of the locations on creation. And then we have a very simple bit of JSX here, returning some content, just an h1 tag that says add a new device. So let's now write the getLocations function. And in fact, we have already written this function. So if we go to the device detail page, we have a function here called getLocations that calls the Django-Ninja endpoint. We're going to copy this and we can paste that into this new component file. So let's paste that at the top here, and that's going to return all of the locations and store them in our component. Now, just to allow us to navigate to this form page, we're going to go to the device list page, and that's this page here. What we're going to do is we're going to add a new link that's going to allow us to go to that form page. So let's go to the device list page here, and that will be located in the app directory, and it's in the devices directory, and it's the page.js file in here. Now if we go to the code here, we already have a link for each one of the devices in the application. I'm very quickly going to add another link here just below that div. So I'm going to paste that in, and again some indentation here. This is a link to our new page, which is /devices/create, and we have a button here, and the button is going to say add device. When we click that, we're going to be taken to that new page. So let's test that out. If we save this and go back here, we have a button now, and that has that DaisyUI button class. When we click the button, you can see we're taken to this new page, which currently only has a header. Now what we need to do here is we need to actually add a form that's going to allow us to create a new device and send that data to the Django-Ninja API, store it in the database, and then that device will become available in our application. Now because we're going to work with a form here, this is going to be another client component, and that's because we need to track the state that's being entered on the client side when a user is filling in the form. So let's go back to VS Code, and we're going to go to our new create page. And in fact, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a client component separate from this new component. So let's go to the components directory, and I'm going to create a new file here. And this is going to be called create-device-form.js. Now, as I said, this is going to be a client component, so we'll specify use client at the top of this file, and then we're going to import use state from React. We can now create this client component, and I'm going to call this create-device-form. And again, that's going to take some props that are going to be passed through to that. And we can destructure some locations from the props as we did before by specifying this syntax here. And that stores the locations on the component, and we can then use that in the JSX code. Now let's create a return statement here for what we want to actually show in this form. Now we need a form element here, so we're going to start with that, and that's going to be the root element in this return statement. And then we're going to paste some markup in here. So we have two divs with the class of form control. You can see the top one is going to be for the device name, which is going to be an input element. And the second one here is going to be for the select that's going to allow the user to select a new location. Now that new location, we can actually copy this directly from the modal that we had, and that was this selection here. So let's copy this select box, and we're going to paste that into the create device form. And that's going to be down here in the second one of these divs, and I'll fix the indentation now. Now in order to use the select, we also need to bring in some state here. So we have a state called set selected location, and we have the value selected location as well. So we're going to copy those as well from the location modal. So let's go to the top here, and where we called use state, we're going to copy that line of code, and we're going to paste that into the top of this. So we have the same name for the state and also for the setter, and that exists now on this select, and that's going to work exactly as it did before. Let's now target this div here at the top, and what we want to show in this div is an input element that's going to allow the user to enter the name of this new device. So underneath the label, we are going to create an input of type text, and we're going to give this input some classes from DaisyUI, for example the input and input bordered class, as well as some classes from Tailwind itself. And for now I'm going to close that off, and we're going to save this, and we're going to import this create device form into this new create component, which is on the server side. So at the top here, let's import create device form, and that's coming from that file that we just created. and then we can render that within the return statement on this component. So let's render create device form, and we're going to pass the locations through to that as a prop. And that's all we need to do in order to render that client component here within the server component. So let's now save this, and we're going to see how this looks. If we go back to the form page, you can see that we have a form now, and we have an input element for the device name, and we also have this very simple select box for the device location. Now what we need to do is when we enter a name of a device, we need to actually track that using state. So let's go back to this create device form, and we're going to call useState again. And that's going to store a second bit of state for the new device name. And we also need the setter here, which we're going to call set device name. So we can call useState, and initially we're going to pass just an empty string as before. Now we can employ a similar strategy as we did on the select element. So we're going to set the value, and we're also going to set an onChange event listener. So I'm actually just going to copy these 2 lines of code, and we're going to go back to the input element, and I'm going to paste these in here. We need to update the names here though, so I'm going to use the device name for the actual value here. So the value at a given time for this piece of state is going to be reflected in the input value, and we also need to update the setter function here. So let's scroll up, and we're going to copy the set device name, and we're going to set that on the input element. So when the input changes, it's going to call the set device name function and update the state for the device name. And the final thing to do at the bottom, just before we end the form, is we need to add the submit button. Let's save that and go back to our page, and you can see this now looks a little bit better with the submit button. But at the moment, when we add a new device here, it's not actually going to do anything. It's not going to add that to the database because we don't have any requests being sent from the Next.js client component to the Django application in the back end. So let's go back to VS Code, and on the form element, we're going to add an onSubmit handler. And again, that can only be applied to a client component. And we're going to call a function called handleSubmit. So let's copy the name of that function. We're going to go up here, and we're going to create a variable. And this function is going to take the event as a parameter. And we're going to call event.preventDefault in order to prevent that submission and to prevent the page from reloading. Now we need an endpoint in order to create a new device. So if we go back to the Django-Ninja API.py file, if we go up here, we have a post request to API/devices. That's where we're going to send that request. So let's go back to the form, and I'm going to create an endpoint here that's pointing to that particular handler. And then we're going to create a body of data that we're going to send to that endpoint. Now first of all, the name of the new device, that's going to be set to the device name. That's a piece of state that we've got in this component. And we also need to pass a location ID, and that is potentially for the location of the device, but this can be null. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use the selected location. I'm just going to paste that in here. If that's set to a value, we're going to use that. Otherwise, we can use null. So this is the body of data. We can then send a fetch request to our endpoint, and we're going to attach some configuration here. First of all, it's going to be a post request. And secondly, we're going to add the body, and we're going to call json.stringify and pass that body that we created above into that function. Now once we've sent the fetch request, we can then call .then, and we get a response with the response data from the endpoint. We can convert that to a JavaScript object with response.json, and then we get back some data here. And for now, what I want to do is just console.log that data to the browser's console. And hopefully this is going to be enough to actually add the new device to the database. So let's save this and go back to our page. And I'm going to add a new device here, and let's just call this random sensor. And we want to set a location for this one, and it's going to be the garage. So when we submit that, nothing is happening, but if we look at the browser console, we have an object being printed here, and you can see we have some details. Let me try and make this bigger so we can see it. We have an ID that's been generated. We have the nested location, which contains the ID of the location and the name. And we also have the name of the new device and the slug for that particular device. And this looks to have worked. We've got a response from the Django-Ninja API. We have created a new object in the database that has this ID, and our form is now working, and we can then push that data to the back end. And hopefully if we go back to the device list page, let me go back to that now. When we refresh that page, you can see that we have the random sensor appearing in the list. Now what we actually want to do in the component, when we get back the response, instead of console.logging that response, what we're going to do is we're going to create a function here. And again, I want to use the router object from Next.js. So let's go back to that component that used the router, and that was the location modal. We're going to import that and bring that into our create device form. So let's bring that import in at the top, and we're going to call useRouter. Let me remember to do that this time. And we're going to create a variable called router and just call the useRouter hook. Now once we have our router available, we can then go back to this .then block, and we're going to call router.push, and we're going to push a new URL into the router here, and that's going to be /devices. And what this is going to do is it's going to navigate to our new URL. And the page that we have here is the device list page, so it should take us back there. Let's test this out and go back to the add device form. I'm going to add a new device here. Let's just call it test sensor, and we'll set the location for that one to the greenhouse. When we actually submit that, the data is going to the back end and we are redirected to the list page. Now you might notice that the test sensor is not showing up by default, but if we refresh the page and clear the cache, then it's going to show up. Now the problem here is that the cache in Next.js is not fetching that new data from the server. So what we're going to do is again add a call to router.refresh, and when we call that function, it's going to send the request to the backend. It's going to refetch and revalidate that data and update the front end. So let's try this again. If we go back to the form, and we're going to add another test device, add 2 to the end of that, and we're going to add a location of greenhouse. When we submit that and go back to the page, you can see that it is now showing up. And if you have any issues with this approach, what you can do, if we go back to VS Code here, I'm going to go back to the device detail page. Now that was under the dynamic slug directory, so let's go to page.js, and in this file we have at the top a function called getDevice. And when you call fetch, you have the option of passing some configuration. We've already seen that with the post request method, but one thing you can do that's specific to Next.js is add this cache no store, and that means that Next.js is not going to try and cache the response, and when the user comes to that page again, it's going to refetch the data from scratch, and that way you're always going to get an up-to-date set of data. So that's all for this video. We built this small API with Django-Ninja, and we've now built a Next.js/React application around that API. We can look at a list of devices, we can look at individual device detail pages, and we can assign new locations to devices using this form here. And that's going to work by calling the Django-Ninja backend and updating the data in the database. And if we go back here, we now also have a form that's going to allow us to add a new device to the database. And the styles in this app are very basic, but we have used DaisyUI and 𝗬𝗏 in order to make things like these buttons look quite good on the user interface. Of course, there's much more you would want to do in a real application, but this is just a demo anyway. Now I want to add one more video where I'm going to look at a package called Django-Ninja Extra, which allows you to build class-based controllers for your API endpoints, and it also gives you permissions and throttling and other functionality that comes commonly with Django REST framework. This new package, Django-Ninja Extras, it's going to bring some of that functionality into the Django-Ninja ecosystem. So we're going to look at that in the next video. If you're interested in any more of this Next.js content, please let me know in the comments. Please give the video a thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and consider buying the channel a coffee if you're enjoying this content. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.